Drag Harlan by Charles Seltzer. Chapter 16. Deep Water. Despite his conviction that he stood in the presence of the mysterious chief of whom he had heard much, Harlan's expression did not change. There was a new interest added to it and a deeper glow in his eyes, but he gave no outward evidence of surprise. "I reckon I searched him," he said, answering Hayden's charge. "If I found anything on him, I'm turnin' it over to Barbara Morgan, or hangin' onto it. That is my business." Hayden laughed, for Harlan's voice had broken the tension that had come with the interval of threatening silence. Since he could not induce Harlan to divulge anything of interest, there was nothing to do but to withdraw as gracefully as possible. And he backed away, smiling, saying placatively, "No offense intended, Harlan. I was merely curious on Barbara's account." He mounted his horse, urged it along the corral fence, and sent back a smiling. So long, motionless, still standing where he had stood when Hayden climbed on his horse, Harlan watched while the man rode the short distance to the house. At the corner around which he had appeared some minutes before, Hayden brought his horse to a halt, waved a hand, at Barbara, Harlan supposed, and then rode on, heading westward toward Sunset Trail. Harlan watched him until he had penetrated far into the big valley. Then he turned slowly and sought Red Linton, finding him in the blacksmith shop. Later in the day, after Harlan and Linton had talked long, standing in the door of the blacksmith shop, Linton mounted his horse and rode to where Harlan stood. Linton was prepared for a long ride. Folded in the slicker that was strapped to the cantle of his saddle was food. He carried his rifle in the saddle sheath, and a water bag bulged above the horse's withers. "You won't find all the tea-down boys yearnin' to bust into this ruckus," Harlan said as he stood near Linton's horse as Linton grinned down at him. "But there'll be some. Put it right up to them that it ain't going to be no pussy, kitten job, and that it is likely some of them won't ever see the tea-down again. But to offset that, you can tell them that if we make good, the Rancho Seco will owe them a heap, and they'll get what is common to them." He watched while Linton rode eastward over the big level. Then he grinned and walked to the ranch house, going around the front and standing in the wide gateway where he saw Barbara sitting on a bench in the patio, staring straight ahead, meditatively. Unaware that he was standing in the gateway watching her, Harlan watched the girl for a long time, until she turned and saw him. Then she blushed and stood up, looking at him in slight wonderment as he came toward her and stood within a few feet of her. On Harlan's face was a slow, genial grin. "Sunning yourself, eh?" he said. "Well, it is a mighty nice day, not too hot. Have you knowed him long?" The startling irrelevance of the question caused Barbara to gaze sharply at Harlan, and when their eyes met, she noted that his were twinkling with a light that she could not fathom. She hated him when she could not understand him. "Mr. Hayden, do you mean?" she questioned, a sudden coldness in her voice. Harlan nodded. "A little more than a year, I think. It was just after I returned from school at Denver." He watched her, saying lowly, "So it was Denver. I'd been wonderin'. I knowed it must have been someplace. Schoolin' is a thing that I never had time to monkey with. I reckon my folks didn't believe a heap in 'em. You've lived in the West all your life. You were born in the West, I suppose." He looked keenly at her. "I expect you knowed that without askin'. I've been wonderin' if it would have made any difference." "How? In me? Do you think an education makes a man act different? Gives him different ideas about his actions? In his dealings with women, for instance?" "I expect it does. Education should make a man more considerate of women. It is refining." "Then you reckon a man that ain't had any education is coarse and don't know how to treat a woman?" "I didn't say that. I said education should make a man treat women that way. But it don't always. I think not. I have known men, well-educated men, who failed to treat women as they should be treated." "Then that ain't what you might call a hard and fast rule. It don't always work. And there is hope for any man who ain't had schoolin', if he is wantin' to be a man, certainly. But an educated man can't claim ignorance when he aims to mistreat a woman. That is how it figures up, ain't it?" She laughed. "It would seem to point to that conclusion. So you've knowed Hayden about a year. I reckon he is educated." "Yes." She watched him closely, wondering at his meaning, why he had brought Hayden's name into the discussion. She was marveling at the subtle light in his eyes. "Your father liked Hayden. He told me Hayden was the only square man in the country, besides himself and Sheriff Gage." Father liked Hayden. I'm beginning to believe you really did have a talk with Father before he died, he smiled. Going back to Hayden, I had a talk with him a little while ago. I sort of took a shine to him. He drew from a pocket the section of gold chain he had found on the desert, holding it out to her. Here is a piece of Hayden's watch chain, he said slowly, watching her face. The next time Hayden comes to see you, give it to him, telling him I found it. It is likely he'll ask you where I found it, but you can say I wasn't mentioning. He turned, looking back over his shoulder at her as he walked toward the gate. She stood, holding the glittering links in the palm of one hand, doubt and suspicion in her eyes. Why? She called after him. He was just here, and you say you talked with him. Why didn't you give it to him? Forgot it, ma'am, and I reckon you'll be seeing him before I do. Then he strode out through the gate, leaving her to speculate upon the mystery of his words and his odd action in leaving the chain with her when he could have personally returned it to Hayden. Harlan, however, was grinning as he returned to the bunkhouse, for he wanted Barbara to see Hayden's face when the section of chain was returned to him, to gain whatever illumination she could from the incident. He did not care to tell her yet that Hayden had killed her father, but he did desire to create in her mind a doubt of Hayden, so that she would hesitate to confide to him everything that happened at the Rancho Seco. For himself, he wanted to intimate delicately to Hayden his knowledge of what had really occurred at Sentinel Rock. It was a message to the man conveying a significance that Hayden could not mistake. It meant that for some reason, known only to himself, Harlan did not intend to tell what he knew. Chapter 17. Forging a letter. The impulse which had moved Harlan to send Red Linton to the T-Down Ranch to enlist the services of some of his old friends had resulted from a conviction that he could not depend upon those men of the Rancho Seco outfit who had seemed to him to be unfriendly to Stroud. The straw boss, he knew nothing about them, and their loyalty to Barbara Morgan might be of a quality that would not endure through the sort of trouble that seemed to be imminent. The T-Down men, those who would come, would stand with him no matter what happened. They would do his will without question. There was no doubt in Harlan's mind that John Hayden was the mysterious chief, the man who had sent into Lane Morgan's breast the bullet that had ultimately killed him, and there was no doubt that some powerful secret force was at work in the country, and that the force was directing its attention to the Rancho Seco and the defenseless girl who was at the nominal head of it. For some reason, the secret force had killed her father, had isolated the ranch, had encompassed it with enemies, and was working slowly and surely to enmesh the girl herself. Harlan was convinced that one of the motives behind the subtle aggressions of the men was a yearning for the gold that Morgan had left. In fact, the presence of Dolver and Lascar at Sentinel Rock, and Morgan's word to him about the gold, provided sufficient evidence on that score. They had watched Morgan. They suspected he was taking gold to Pardo to have it assayed, and they had killed him in the hope of finding something on his person, which would reveal to them where he had hidden the rest of it. One other motive was that of the eternal, ages-old passion of a man for woman. Evidence of that passion had been revealed to Harlan at Lamo, by the attack on Barbara by Deveny's hireling, Higgins by the subtle advances of John Hayden. It seemed to Harlan that all of these men had been, and were, equally determined to possess the girl, and yet, back of it all, behind that which had been rendered visible by the actions of the man, and by Harlan's own deductions, was something else, something stealthy and hidden, a secret threat of dire things to come, a lingering promise of trickery standing at one of the gates of the corral upon the third morning following Linton's departure. Harlan considered this phase of the situation. He felt the hidden threat of something sinister that lurked in the atmosphere. It was all around him. It seemed to lie secreted in the yawning space that engulfed the Rancho Seco, south, north, and east. From the haze that stretched into the unending distance westward, it seemed to come, bearing its whispered promise. The solemn hills that flanked the wide stretches of Sunset Valley seemed to hint of it, somberly. Mystery was in the serene calm that seemed to encompass the big basin, from the far reaches westward in the misty veil that seemed to hang from the far flung shafts of sunlight that penetrated the fleecy clouds came the sinister threat. The whole section seemed to pulse with it, and yet Harlan knew there could be no mystery except the mysteries of men. Nature was the same here as in any other section of the world, and her secrets were not more profound than usual. He grinned mirthlessly at the wonderful basin. noting that the Rancho Seco building seemed to lie on a direct line with its center, that the faint trail that ran through the basin, the trail men traveled, came on in its undulating way straight toward the Rancho Seco ranch house, seemed to bring the mystery of the big basin with it, seemed to be a link that connected the Rancho Seco with the promise of trouble. That impression might have engaged the serious thoughts of some men. It widened the smile on Harlan's face, for he knew there was no threat in the beauty of the valley, that it did not hide its secrets from the prying eyes of men. Whatever secret the valley held was in the minds of men, the minds of Deveny and the mysterious chief and their followers. Harlan had not absented himself from the ranch house since the departure of Linton. He had lounged in the vicinity of the buildings during the day, and Barbara had seen him many times from the windows, and he had spent his nights watching the ranch house, half expecting another attack on Barbara. The girl had seen him at night too, and she had smiled at the picture he made with the moonlight shining upon him, or standing in some shadow, somber, motionless, undoubtedly guarding her. She saw him this morning too, as he stood beside the corral gate, and there was a glow in her eyes that, had he seen it, might have thrilled him with its gratitude. She came out of a rear door after a while, and Harlan was still standing at the gate. He watched her as she came toward him. It was the first time she had ventured in that direction since the return from Lama with him, noting that she seemed to be in better spirits, that she was smiling. "You looked lonesome," she said as she halted near him. "Did Linton join the outfit?" "It is likely. He went 3 days ago. I knew he had gone. I saw you several times. And you were always alone, and," she added, looking keenly at him, "I saw you several times, at night. Don't you ever sleep?" "I reckon I'm a sort of restless cuss." Her face took on serious lines. "Look here, Harlan," she said reprovingly. "You are keeping something back. You have been watching the ranch house at night, and during the day you are guarding me. Why is it? Do you think I am going to run away from me?" he queried. "I was hoping you wouldn't." She stiffened with exasperation, for she felt the insincerity in his manner, caught the humorous note in his voice. "You are treating me as you would treat a child," she declared, "and I won't have it. Are you watching me because you fear there might be another Lawson?" "There might be. Nonsense. There isn't another man in the section would dare what Lawson dare. Gentlemen, he said tauntingly. "Well, I've nosed around quite considerable, and I don't remember to have ever run into a place where there was fewer men than in this neck of the woods. There are plenty of gentlemen. Do you think John Hayden?" Harlan grinned faintly. "He has been fanning it right along for half an hour," he said with seeming irrelevance. "Who?" she asked with a swift, uncomprehending glance at him. "Your gentleman," he said slowly. She followed the direction of his gaze and saw, on the trail that led downward from a little table, land to the level that stretched toward the ranch house, a horseman coming rapidly toward them. "It is Mr. Hayden," she ejaculated, her voice leaping. "So it is," said Harlan dryly. He looked keenly at her, noting the flush on her face, the brightness of her eyes. "You ain't forgetting to give him that piece of chain." "Why?" she said, drawing the glittering links from a pocket of her skirt. "I have it here. You may return it to him." "Me and Hayden ain't on speaking terms," he smiled. "He wouldn't appreciate it none if I give it to him." "Why?" she began, only to pause and look at him with a sudden comprehension in her eyes, for into Harlan's face had come an expression that, she thought, she could analyze. It was jealousy. That was why he was reluctant to return the chain to Hayden. The situation was so positively puerile, she thought, that she almost felt like laughing. She would have laughed had it not been that she knew of Harlan's unfailing vigilance, and that she felt differently toward him now than she had felt during the first days of their acquaintance. His steadfast vigilance, she decided, must have been responsible for the change, together with the steady consideration he revealed for her. At any rate, something about him had affected her. She felt more gentle toward him, more inclined to believe in him, and there had been times during the past few days when she had been astonished at the subtle, warm sensation that had stolen over her whenever she saw him or whenever she thought of him. Something of that warmth toward him was in her eyes now as she watched him, and she decided that she should humor his whim, that she should perform the action that he was reluctant to perform. She smiled, with the wisdom of a woman to whom a secret had been unwittingly revealed. "You don't like Hayden. Him and me ain't going to be bosom friends. Why don't you like him?" she asked banteringly. She thought his grin was brazen. "Why don't you like me?" "I don't know," she said coldly, but her face reddened a little. "Well," he laughed, "that is why I don't like Hayden." Hayden had crossed the big level and was close to the ranch house. The girl had determined to remain where she was, to return the piece of chain to Hayden in the presence of Harlan, in order to learn what she could of the depth of Harlan's dislike for Hayden when in the presence of the latter. And so a silence came between them as they watched Hayden ride toward them. When Hayden rode close to them, he halted his horse and sat in the saddle, an expression of cold inquiry on his face. His smile at Miss Barbara was a trifle forced. His glance at Harlan had a fair measure of frank dislike and suspicion in it. Harlan deliberately turned his back toward Barbara and Hayden when the latter dismounted, walked a little distance, and pretended to be interested in a snubbing post in the corral. Yet he cast furtive glances toward the two, and when he saw the girl reaching into a pocket for the section of chain he had given her, he slowly sauntered forward and was within hearing distance when Barbara spoke to Hayden. "I was to give you this," she said, and she extended a hand toward Hayden, the chain dangling from her fingers. Harlan saw Hayden's muscles leap and become tense. He saw the man's color go, saw his cheeks whiten, observed that his eyes widened and gleamed with mingled astonishment and alarm. He regained control of himself instantly, however, but Harlan had seen enough to strengthen his convictions, and he grinned as Hayden flashed a sharp glance at him. Barbara, too, had noted the strange light in Hayden's eyes. She had seen that Hayden had seemed about to shrink from the chain when she held it out to him. She looked from Hayden to Harlan inquiringly, and when her glance again returned to Hayden, he was smiling. However, he had not taken the chain from her hand. "Is it yours?" she asked. "Yes, mine," he answered hesitatingly. "Where did you find it?" "Mr. Harlan found it." Barbara noted Hayden's quick start, the searching glance he gave Harlan, who was now leaning on a rail of the corral fence, seemingly uninterested. Hayden laughed a little hoarsely, it seemed to Barbara, and more loudly than the occasion seemed to demand. She thought, though, that the laugh might have been a jeer for Harlan's action in turning the chain over to her instead of returning it directly to the owner. She did not catch the searching inquiry of Hayden's glance at Harlan, nor did she see Harlan's odd smile at Hayden and the slow wink that accompanied it. But the wink and the smile conveyed to Hayden the intelligence that Harlan knew the story connected with the loss of the chain, and that he had not communicated it to the girl. They also expressed to Hayden the message that Harlan and Hayden were kindred souls. The smile and the wink told Hayden that this man who knew his secret was secretly applauding him, even while inwardly laughing at him for his fear that the secret would be betrayed. Harlan's voice broke a short silence. "Found it right about here. The other day. It must have laid there a long time, for it took a heap of polishing to brighten it up." Again he closed an eye at Hayden, and the latter grinned broadly. Barbara silently endured a pang of disappointment. She had caught Harlan's wink. The man had betrayed jealousy only a few minutes ago, and he had refused personally to return the chain to Hayden. And yet he stood there now, smiling and winking at the other, evidently with the desire to ingratiate himself. Sycophant, weakling, or fool, which was he? She shuddered with disgust, deliberately turned her back to Harlan, and began to walk toward the ranch house, Hayden following. And Harlan, standing at the fence, leaned an elbow on one of the rails and watched the two, an enigmatic smile on his face. For he had succeeded in opening a gate which disclosed a trail that would lead him straight to the mystery, a breath of which had been borne to him that morning upon the slight breeze that had swept down to him from the mighty valley out of which Hayden had ridden. Between him and Hayden a bond had been established, fashioned from the links of the section of chain. Chapter 18. Harlan rides alone. Upon the morning of the fourth day following Hayden's visit to the Rancho Seco, a dust cloud developed on the northwestern horizon. Harlan observed the cloud. He had been watching for it since dawn, when he had emerged from the stable door, where he had been looking after Purgatory. From the ranch house, Barbara also saw the cloud, and she ran upstairs to one of the north windows. There, with her face pressed against the glass, she watched the cloud grow in size, observed that it was dotted with the forms of horsemen, saw at last that the horsemen were headed straight for the Rancho Seco. Then, wondering, anxious, eager, she descended the stairs and ran out to where Harlan was standing, speaking breathlessly. "What does it mean? Who are they?" "It'll be Red Linton and some tea-down boys." down Pardo men from where I used to work. I sent Linton for them. If I'm going to run a ranch, I aim to run it with men I can depend on. She had hardly spoken to him in the 4 days that had elapsed since Hayden's last visit, for the disgust she had felt that day had endured. But there was something new in his manner now, a briskness, a business, like air that made her look sharply at him. He smiled at her, and in the smile was a snapping humor that puzzled her. She stood, watching for a while, until the group of horsemen became clearly defined, and then with a sudden fear that the men might be outlaws of the same type as Harlan. Possibly he had sent for them because they were. She returned to the ranch house and watched from one of the windows. When the tea-down men rode up to the corral gate, they dismounted and surrounded Harlan. There were 10 of them, rugged-looking fellows of various ages, bepistoled, begrimed with dust, and articulate with profane expressions of delight. "Hell's a poppin', Red says," yelled one. "He says there is geezers here which is pinin for your gore. Turn me loose on 'em. Oh, turn me loose." The men, tired, dusty, and hungry, swarmed into one of the bunkhouses immediately after they had turned their horses into the corral and cared for their saddles. The men were in good spirits despite their long ride, and for half an hour after they descended upon the bunkhouse, the air pulsed with their talk and their laughter as they washed their dust-stained faces from the tin wash basin on the bench outside the door, and combed their hair with a comb attached to a rawhide thong that swung from the wall above the basin. They had been informed by Red Linton regarding the situation that had developed at the Rancho Seco. Fully informed before they had begun their trip westward, Linton scrupulously and faithfully presenting to them the dangers that confronted them, and though some of them were still curious and sought a word with Harlan in confirmation, they seemed to be satisfied to trust to Harlan's judgment. Their faith was of the kind that needs but little verbal reassurance. That they admired the man who had sent for them, there was little doubt, for they watched him with glowing eyes as he talked with them, revealing their pride that they had been selected. Hardy, clear-eyed, serenely unafraid, they instantly adapted themselves to the new job, and before their first meal was finished, they were thoroughly at home. Shortly afterward, while the men were lounging about inside, Harlan drew Linton outside. "That is the bunch I would have picked if I had gone myself," complimented Harlan. "I'm thanking you a heap." He whispered to Linton the story of Hayden's last visit, and for the first time Linton heard about the section of chain which convicted Hayden of the murder of Lane Morgan. Linton's eyes gleamed. "I've always sort of suspected the son of a gun," he declared, "and him making love to Barbara, the sneaking coyote. And so you're going to see him. I'd be a whole lot careful." Harlan's smile was grave. "I'm reckoning to be. I'd have gone before this, but I was waiting for you boys. Nobody is saying anything to anybody. You're sticking close to the Rancho Seco, not letting Barbara out of your sight. That is what I wanted you and the other guys for. I'm playing the rest of it a lone hand." Leaving Linton standing near the bunkhouse, he went to the stable where he threw saddle and bridle on Purgator. Then he mounted, waved a hand at Linton, who was watching him, and rode to the ranch house. At the northwest corner, around which Hayden had ridden on the occasion of his last visit, he brought Purgatory to a halt, for he saw Barbara just emerging from the patio gate. She halted in the opening when she observed him, making a picture that was vivid in his memory for many days afterward. For her eyes were alight with wonder, her cheeks were flushed, and she was breathing fast, for she had watched from a window the coming of the tea-down men. She had noted the conference between Harlan and Linton, and she had seen Harlan waving a hand at the red-haired man seemingly in farewell. She stood now, afflicted with a strange regret, suddenly aware that she would feel the absence of the man who sat on his horse before her, for she divined that he was going. "I'm sayin' so long to you, ma'am," smiled Harlan. "Oh," she said, aware of the flatness of her tone. "Are you going away?" "I'm figurin' to go. I ain't used to hanging around one place very long, but I'm comin' back someday. Red Linton and the boys will be seeing that things go smooth with you. You can depend on Red and all the boys. There's Simon, pure, dyed in the wool, 18-karat man." And now he grinned gravely. "Remember this, Barbara. A man will do things when he is handling a gold chain. Things that he wouldn't do if there didn't happen to be any chain." He doffed his hat and slapped Purgatory sharply, heading the animal westward, toward the yawning mouth of the big basin that stretched its mighty length into the mystery of distance. But his words left her with a conviction that she had again misjudged him, and that when he had appeared to fawn on Hayden, he had been merely acting, merely pretending. She watched him, regretfully, longingly, assailed by emotions that she could not understand, until he and Purgatory grew small in the gulf of distance, until horse and rider were swallowed in the glowing haze. Chapter 19. Harlan joins the gang. At the edge of the big level, where it merged into the floor of the basin, Harlan drew Purgatory to a halt. For an instant, he sat in the saddle scrutinizing a section of buffalo grass that fringed a clump of willows near the almost dry bed of the river that doubled slightly as it came from the basin. Something in the appearance of the grass had attracted his attention. It was matted, as though something had lain or rolled in it. He rode closer, cautiously, for the little trees formed a covert behind which any one of several dangers might lie concealed, and looked down at the grass. As he examined the place, his lips twisted into a grim smile, and his eyes grew bright with comprehension. He rode around the clump of trees, making sure it was not occupied. Then he dismounted. Someone had been concealed in the covert for many days. A man, for he saw the imprints of heels and indentations where spurs had gashed the earth. The marks were all fresh, recently made. While he watched, he saw some blades of the long grass slowly rise, as though relieved from some pressure that had been upon them. They were eager to regain an upright position. He also saw scraps of food, jerked beef and biscuit, scattered here and there. He frowned, convinced that for days a man had occupied the covert, watching the Rancho Seco. Convinced also that the mystery he had sensed some days ago had been man-made, as he had felt. The man who had been there had been a sentinel, a spy, sent by Deveny or Hayden to observe his movements, and to report them, of course, to one or the other of the two outlaws. Harlan remounted Purgatory. His caution had not been wasted, and his vigilance in guarding the ranch house must have been irritating to the man who had been watching. He urged Purgatory on again, heading him westward as before, and when he reached the crest of a slight rise in the valley, from where he could see the trail as it twisted and undulated around hills and into depressions, he saw far up the valley, and yet not so far either, not more than 2 miles, a horseman riding slowly. Away from him, the horseman was the spy, of course. Harlan had no doubt that if he lingered in the vicinity of the covert long enough, he would discover the place where the horse had been concealed. But that was not important, now that he had discovered enough to satisfy himself that there had been a spy, and so he rode on, smiling faintly, knowing that the rider was headed into the valley, possibly to the outlaw rendezvous to apprise Deveny and the others of his coming. The trail was clearly defined, and there were places where it ran over broad levels of grass where he presented a good target to men who might be eager to send a shot at him. There were other spots where the trail led into timber clumps and through tangles of brush where an ambuscade might be planned in perfect safety by an enemy. And there were the bastion cliffs that towered above the trail at intervals, offering admirable hiding places for any man with hostile intentions. Harlan, however, rode steadily, outwardly unconcerned, inwardly convinced that no attempt would be made to ambush him, for Hayden has passed that way on his return to the Star. And Harlan had no doubt that since the incident of the smile and the wink, Hayden had passed word that he was not to be molested. Hayden would be curious, as he had been curious at the Rancho Seco, to learn the significance of the smile and the wink. Hayden would want to discover just how much Harlan knew about the murder of Lane Morgan, and he would want to know what Harlan knew of the gold that Morgan had secreted. And so Harlan rode on, watching the country through which he passed, but feeling assured there would be no shot to greet him from one of the many natural vantage points he encountered. He rode for an hour, not making very good time, for it was a new trail, and he was examining the country intently as he passed, fixing it in his memory for future convenience, perhaps. No one ever knew just when it might be necessary to use one's knowledge. When he reached a low ridge which crossed the valley, here he halted Purgatory and gazed about him. Before him stretched a green grass level, about 2 miles long, running the entire width of the valley. It was dotted with mesquite, sage, and here and there the thorny blade of a cactus rose. Some cattle were grazing on the level. They were several miles south, and he could see some horsemen near them. He decided he must be close to the Star, and he urged Purgatory on again, down upon the level, towards some timber that grew at the farther edge of the level. Just as he slipped down the slope of the ridge, he saw, far ahead of him, the horseman he had seen when he had entered the valley. The horseman was on the crest of a bald hill, low and small, but Harlan caught a glimpse of him as he crossed it, riding fast. Harlan smiled again and rode on his way. Resuming his scrutiny of the country, the valley was mighty, magnificent. It deserved all the praise Barbara Morgan had heaped upon it. From the low mountain range on the north to the taller mountains southward, it was a virgin paradise in which reigned a peace so profound that it brought a reverent awe into the soul of the beholder. It thrilled Harlan despite the certain blase matter of fact attitude he had for all of nature's phenomena. He found himself admiring the majestic buttes that fringed it. There was a glint of appreciation in his eyes for the colossal bigness of it, for the gigantic, sweeping curves which seemed to make of it an oblong bowl, a cosmic hollow, boundless, hinting of the infinite power of its builder. The trail that ran through it, drawled to thread-like proportions by the mightiness of the space through which it ran, was, for the greater part of the distance traveled by Harlan, a mere scratch upon a low rock ridge. And as he rode, he could look down upon the floor of the valley, green and inviting. When he entered the timber at the edge of the grass level, he was conscious of a stealthy sound behind him. He turned quickly in the saddle to see a man standing at the edge of some brush that fringed the trail. The man was big. A heavy black beard covered his chin and portions of his cheeks. His hat was drawn well down over his forehead, partially shielding his eyes. A rifle in his hands was held loosely, and though it appeared that the man did not intend to use the weapon immediately, Harlan could see that his right forefinger was touching the trigger, and that the muzzle of the weapon was suggestively toward him. For the past few miles of his ride, Harlan had been expecting an apparition of this sort to appear, and so he now gave no sign of surprise. Instead, he slowly raised both hands until they were on a level with his shoulders, and still twisted about in the saddle. He grinned faintly at the man. "From now on, I'm to have company, eh?" he said. The man smirked grimly at him. "You've hit it," he answered. "You're Harlan, ain't you?" "Drag Harlan, the Pardo 2, gunman." The man's eyes were glowing with interest, critical, almost cynical, and they roved over Harlan with a probing intensity that left no doubt in Harlan's mind that the man had heard of him and was examining him with intent to discover what sort of a character he was. Apparently satisfied, and also plainly impressed with what he saw, the man grinned, this time almost genially, and answered Harlan's affirmative nod with, "Well, Hayden is expectin' you. You can let your paws down. Takin' a heap of care not to go to foolin' with your guns. I ain't takin' them." Hayden didn't say anything about it. "You're ridin' that trail that forks off to the left." Harlan lowered his hands, resting them on the pommel of his saddle, and rode on, taking, as advised, a narrow trail that diverged from the other, a short distance from where he had met the man. As he struck the other trail, he heard the man coming behind him, on a horse. There were no further words. Harlan kept to the trail, riding slowly, the man behind him following at a short distance. In this manner they rode for perhaps a mile. Then the timber grew sparse, and Purgatory and his rider at last emerged upon a level that extended about 100 feet, and then sloped down abruptly to another level, through which flowed a narrow stream of water, shallow and clear. Close to the bank of the stream was an adobe ranch house, and surrounding it were several other buildings. At a slight distance from the house was a corral in which were several horses. In front of a bunkhouse were several men who, when they saw Harlan and the other man coming, faced toward them and stood, motionless, watching. The men maintained silence as Harlan rode to the ranch house and sat in the saddle, awaiting the pleasure of his escort. He saw the latter grin at the other men as he passed them, and he grinned at Harlan as he brought his horse to a halt near Purgatory and dismounted. "I reckon you're to get off and visit," he said. "Hayden is inside." As he dismounted and trailed the reins over the head of his beast, he cast a sharp, critical eye over Purgatory. "There's a heap of hoss in that black, eh?" "Plenty." Harlan got down and ran a hand over Purgatory's neck, while trailing the reins over his head. "Man killer," he warned. "Don't touch him. He ain't been rode by nobody but me, and he won't stand for nobody foolin' around him." Harlan had raised his voice until he was sure the men in front of the bunkhouse heard him. Then he grinned genially at them all and followed the black-bearded man into the ranch house. An instant later, in a big room which had the appearance of an office, Harlan was confronting Hayden. The latter was sitting in a chair at a desk, and when Harlan entered, Hayden got up and grinned at him, shallowly, without mirth. "So you got here," he said. "I've been expecting you. I've been notin' that." That guy you left at the edge of the level to keep an eye on the Rancho Seco didn't cover his tracks. I run onto them, and I saw him hittin' the breeze. Comin' here. I reckon nobody is surprised." Harlan grinned widely. "So you noticed that," said Hayden, answering Harlan's grin. "Well, I don't mind admitting that we've kept an eye on you. You've had me guessing." Hayden's manner was that of the man who is careful not to say too much. His constraint was of the quality that hints of a desire to become confidential. A smooth, bland courtesy, a flattering voice, encouraging, suggesting frankness. Harlan's manner was that of a certain reckless carelessness. He seemed to be perfectly at ease, confident, deliberate, and unwatchful. He knew Hayden was an outlaw, that the men who had been grouped in front of the bunkhouse were members of Hayden's band. He knew the man who had escorted him to the Star had been deliberately stationed in the timber to watch for him, and he had no doubt that other outlaws had lain concealed along the trail to observe his movements. He knew, too, that he had placed himself in a precarious predicament, that his life was in danger, and that he must be exceedingly careful. Yet outwardly he was cool, composed. With Hayden's eyes upon him, he drew a chair to a point near the desk, seated himself in it, drew out paper and tobacco, and rolled a cigarette. Lighting it, he puffed slowly, watching while Hayden dropped into the chair he had vacated at Harlan's appearance. When Hayden dropped into his chair, he grinned admiringly at Harlan. "You're a cool one, Harlan," he said. "I've got to say that for you. But there's no use in flushing. You've come here to tell me something about the chain. Where did you find it?" "At Sentinel Rock, not far from where you plugged Lane Morgan." "You're assuming that I shot Morgan," charged Hayden. "Morgan was assuming too, I reckon," grinned Harlan. "He told me it was you who shot him. He saw your face by the flash of your gun. And he told me where to look for the chain, him not knowing it was a chain. But something." Hayden's eyes gleamed with a cold rage, which he concealed by passing a hand over his forehead, veiling his eyes from Harlan. His lips were wreathed in a smile. "Why didn't you tell me that the other day, the first time I met you?" Harlan laughed. "I was having notions then, notions that I'd be playing her a lone hand. And now," Hayden's eyes were steady with cold inquiry, "I've got other notions. I'm accepting Deveny's invitation to throw in with you." Hayden was silent for an instant, and during the silence his gaze met Harlan's fairly. By the humorous gleam in Harlan's eyes, Hayden divined that the man could not be misled, that he knew something of the situation in the valley, and that he had come here with the deliberate intention of joining the outlaw band. There was, as Hayden had intimated, little use for an attempt at equivocation or pretense. It was a situation that must be faced squarely by both himself and Harlan. Harlan's reputation, and his action in keeping secret from Barbara Morgan the identity of her father's murderer, indicated sincerity on the man's part, and since Harlan knew him to be the murderer of Morgan, it would be absurd for Hayden to pretend that he had no connection with Deveny's band. He could not fool this man. Yet a jealous hatred of Harlan was thinly concealed by the steady smile with which he regarded his visitor. He had felt the antagonism of Harlan that day when he had talked with him at the bunkhouse door. Harlan's manner that day had convinced him that Harlan was jealous of his attentions to Barbara Morgan. Also, there was in his heart a professional jealousy of Harlan's reputation, for this man who sat in his chair so calmly with danger encompassing him was greater than he. Hayden knew it. Had there been any doubt in his mind on that score, it must have been removed by a memory of the manner in which his men had received the news that Harlan had left the Rancho Seco and was on his way up the valley. The rider Harlan had seen had come in with that news, and Hayden had been standing with the group at the bunkhouse when the man arrived, and he had not failed to note the nervous glances of some of the men and the restless eagerness not unmixed with anxiety with which they watched the trail. And now, facing Harlan, he felt the man's greatness, his especial fitness for the career he had adopted. Harlan was the ideal outlaw. He was cool, deep, subtle. He was indomitable. He felt no fear. His will was inflexible, adamant. Hayden felt it. The fear he had experienced at his first meeting with Harlan had endured until this minute. It was strong as ever. Yet he admired the man and knew that since he had come to the valley, he must be considered an important factor. Hayden could not flatly tell him to get out of the valley. He could not order him away from the Rancho Seco. Harlan was in control there. For the rider who had come in with the news that Harlan had set out for the valley had also apprised Hayden of the coming to the Rancho Seco of the men of the T-Down outfit. The rider had not been able to tell Hayden who the men were, of course, but it made little difference. They were friends of Harlan's, for they had come from the direction of the desert from Pardo. It was plain to Hayden that Harlan had come to the valley to stay. It was equally plain that he must be either propitiated or antagonized. He felt that Harlan was giving him his choice. "What do you want? If you throw in with us?" Hayden asked, following the trend of his own thoughts. "That is straight talk," said Harlan. "I'm giving you a straight answer. If I join your bunch, I join on the same footing with you and Deveny. Nothing less. We split everything 3 ways. The other boys tack in their regular share after we take ours. I bring my boys in under the rules you've got that govern the others. I run the Rancho Seco. No one interfering. When I rustle up that gold old Morgan hid, we split it 3 ways. Barbara Morgan goes with the ranch. No one interfering." Color surged into Hayden's face. "You don't want much, do you?" he sneered. "I want what is coming to me, what I'm going to take. If I come in, that is my proposition. You can take it or leave it." Hayden was silent for an instant, studying Harlan's face. What he saw there brought a frown to his own. "Harlan," he said softly, "some of the boys feel a little resentful over the way you sent Dolver and Lasker out. There are several friends of those 2 men outside now. Suppose I should call them in and tell them that the bars are down on you, eh?" If Hayden expected his threat to intimidate Harlan, he was mistaken. Harlan sat motionless, watching the outlaw chief steadily, and into his eyes came a glitter of that cold contempt which Hayden had seen in them on the day he had faced Harlan near the bunkhouse at the Rancho Seco. "You're doing the honors, Hayden," he said. "If you're that kind of a coyote, I don't want to deal with you. If you think you want to pass up a share of that 100,000, start yapping to them boys. It is likely there is some of them hanging around close. Mebbe you've got some of them peeking around corners at me now. I ain't running from no trouble that comes my way. Get going if you're yearning to requisition the mourners." Rage over the threat was now plain in his eyes, for they were aflame with a cold fire as he got up from his chair and stood, crouching a little, his hands lingering near the butts of his guns. Hayden did not move, but his face grew pallid, and he smiled nervously, with shallow mirth. "You are not in a joking mood today, Harlan," he said. "There is jokes and jokes, Hayden. I've come here in good faith. I've been in camps like this before, in Kelso's, Dave Rance's, Blondie Larkin's, and some others. Them men are outlaws, like you and me, and they've done things that make them greater than you and me, in our line. But I've visited them, free and easy going and comin' whenever I pleased. And no man threatening me. Your manners is irritatin' to me. I'm tellin' you so. I'm through. You're tacking me out now, back to the Rancho Seco. You're riding behind me, minus your guns, your mouth shut tighter than you ever shut it before. And if there is any shootin', you'll know it." Plenty. Harlan had brought matters to a crisis suddenly, in a flash. The time for pretense had gone. Hayden could accept Harlan upon the terms he had mentioned, or he could take up the man's challenge with all it implied, bitter warfare between the 2 factions which would be unprofitable to both, and especially to Hayden. It was for Hayden to decide, and he sat for some seconds motionless in the chair before he spoke. Then he got up, taking care to keep his right hand at a respectable distance from the butt of his pistol, and smilingly held out his hand. "It goes your way, Harlan. We take you in on your terms. I beg your pardon for saying what I did. That was just to try you out. I've heard a lot about you, and I wanted to see if you were in earnest. If you really wanted to come in, I'm satisfied." They shook hands, their gaze meeting as they stood close together. The gaze endured for an instant, and then Hayden's fell. The handshake lasted for several seconds, and it was curious to see how Hayden's eyes, after they had become veiled from Harlan's by the drooping lids, glowed with a malignant triumph and cunning. It was also curious to note that something of the same passion was revealed in Harlan's eyes as they rested on the partially closed lids of the other. For there was triumph there too, and comprehension and craft of a kind that might have disturbed Hayden had he seen it. Then their hands parted mutually, and Hayden grinned smoothly and with apparent cordiality at Harlan. He grasped Harlan by an elbow and urged him toward the door through which the latter had entered. "I'll give you a knockdown to the boys now, those that are here," he said. An hour later, after Hayden and the dozen men to whom he had introduced Harlan had watched Harlan ride eastward through the valley toward the Rancho Seco, Hayden rode westward, accompanied by several of the men. They rode for many miles into the heart of the big basin, coming at last to a gorge that wound a serpentine way southward, through some concealing hills into a smaller basin. A heavy timber clump grew at the mouth of the gorge, hiding it from view from the trail that ran through the valley. Some rank underbrush that fringed the timber gave the mouth of the gorge the appearance of a shallow cave, and a wall of rock forming a ragged arch over the entrance heightened the impression. At first glance the place seemed to be impenetrable, but the horsemen filed through easily enough, and the underbrush closed behind them, so that, had they been seen, the watcher might have been startled by their sudden disappearance. Near the center of the little basin stood a huge cabin, built of adobe with a flat roof. In a small corral were a number of cattle. Grazing upon the grass, with which the place was carpeted, were many horses, and lounging in the grass near the cabin, and upon some benches that ranged its walls, were perhaps a dozen men heavily armed. Several of the men grinned as the newcomers rode in and dismounted, and one or two spoke a short greeting to Hayden, calling him chief. Hayden did not linger to talk with the men, though. He dismounted and entered the cabin, where, an instant later, he was talking with Deveny. Hayden's eyes were still triumphant, glowing with a malignant satisfaction. "He is wise, and dead tickled to join," he told Deveny, referring to Harlan, "and I took him in on his own terms. We'll play him along, making him believe he is regular and right, until we get what we want. Then we'll down him." At about the time Hayden was talking with Deveny, Harlan was dismounting at the Rancho Seco corral. The tea-down men were variously engaged, some of them in the corral, others in the stable, and still others in the blacksmith shop, all attending to their new duties. And only Red Linton was at the corral gate to greet Harlan. Triumph was in Harlan's eyes as he grinned at Linton. "I'm a Simon, pure outlaw now, Red," he stated. Hayden didn't hesitate none. "He is a sneaking, scheming devil, and he hates me like poison. But he took me in, reckonin' to play me for a sucker. Looks like things might be interesting," he grinned. "I'm yearning for grub, Red." Later, while Harlan was seated at a table in the cook's shanty, he became aware of a shadow at the door, and he wheeled to see Barbara Morgan looking in at him, her face flushed, a glow in her eyes that was entirely comprehensible to Harlan. She was glad he had returned. Any man with half Harlan's wisdom could have told that, and color of a kind not caused by the wind and sun suffused Harlan's face. She had seen him from one of the kitchen windows, and curiosity, and an impatience that would not permit of delay, had brought her to search for him. "Why," she said, I thought, didn't you say that you were going away?" "Didn't I go?" he grinned. "For a day," she taunted, her voice leaping. "A day," he said gravely. "Why, it was longer than that, wasn't it? Seems that I ain't seen you for years and years." He got up, his hunger forgotten, but when he reached the door he saw her running toward the ranch house, not even looking back. He stood watching her until she opened a door and vanished. Then he grinned and returned to his neglected food, saying aloud, after the manner of men who spend much time in open places, "I'll sure take care of her, Morgan." Chapter 20. Left-handed. Harlan's statement to Hayden to the effect that he had visited the camps of Kelso, Rance, Larkin, and other outlaws had been strictly accurate. At one time or another, each of those outlaw leaders had sent for Harlan to endeavor to prevail upon him to cast his lot with them. So common was the report that Harlan was of their type, and he had been able, as he had told Hayden, to go among them with impunity, unmolested, respected. And even after he had refused to join, they had extended him the courtesy of faith, not even swearing him to secrecy, and he had vindicated their faith by keeping silent regarding them. Knowing, however, that the ethics of men of the type of Kelso, Rance, Larkin, and others provided a safe conduct for any man of their kind that came among them, Harlan had felt contempt for Hayden for his threat, and yet Harlan's rage on that occasion had been largely surface. It had been displayed for effect, to force an instant decision from Hayden. Harlan was aware that his only hope of protecting Barbara Morgan from Hayden and Deveny was in an offensive war. He could not expect to wage such a war by remaining idly at the Rancho Seco, to await the inevitable aggressions of the outlaws, for he did not know when they would strike, nor how. It was certain they would strike, and it was as certain they would strike when he least expected them to. Therefore, he had determined to join them, depending upon his reputation to allay any suspicion they might have regarding his motives. Hayden had taken him into the band, but Harlan had been convinced that Hayden distrusted him. He had seen distrust in Hayden's eyes, and he had known, when Hayden dropped his gaze at the instant they had shaken hands, that the man meditated duplicity. Yet Harlan was determined to appear ignorant that Hayden meditated trickery. He intended to go among the men and deliberately to ignore the threatened dangers. More, to conduct himself in such a manner that Hayden would not suspect that he knew of any danger. It had been a slight incident that had suggested the plan to him, merely a glance at Strom Rogers while the latter, in lame-o, had been watching Deveny. Harlan had seen hatred in Rogers' face, and contempt and jealousy, and he knew that where such passion existed it could be made to grow and flourish by suggestion and by example. And he was determined to furnish the example. He knew something of the passions of men of the type which constituted the band headed by Deveny and Hayden. He knew how their passions might be played upon. He was aware of their respect and admiration for men of notorious reputation, with records for evil deeds and rapid gunslinging. He had seen how Strom Rogers had watched him, with odd respect. He had seen approval in Rogers' eyes when they had exchanged glances in lame-o, and he had heard men in the group in front of the sheriff's office speaking of him in odd whispers. He had never been affected by that sort of adulation, in Lamo or in the days that preceded his visit to the town. But he was not unmindful of the advantage such adulation would give him in his campaign for control of the outlaw camp, and that was what he had determined to achieve. 3 times in as many days he rode up the valley to the Star, each time talking with Hayden, then leaving the latter to go out and lounge around among the men, listening to their talk, but taking little part in it. He did not speak until he was spoken to, and thus he challenged their interest, and they began to make advances to him. Their social structure was flimsy and thin, their fellowship as spontaneous as it was insincere, and within a few days the edge had worn off the strangeness that had surrounded Harlan, and he had been accepted with hardly a ripple of excitement. And yet no man among them had achieved intimacy with Harlan. There was a cold constraint in his manner that held them off, figuratively barring them from becoming familiar with him. Several of them tried familiarity, and were astonished to discover that they had somehow failed, though they had been repelled so cleverly that they could not resent it. Harlan had established a barrier without them being aware of how he had done it, the barrier of authority and respect behind which he stood, an engaging, saturnine, interesting, compelling figure. At the end of a week, the men of the Star outfit were addressing him as boss, listening to him with respect when he spoke, striving for his attention, and trying to win from him one of those rare smiles with which he honored those among them whose personalities interested him. At the end of 2 weeks, half of the Star outfit was eager to obey any order he issued, while the remainder betrayed some slight hesitation, which, however, vanished when Harlan turned his steady gaze upon them. Behind their acceptance of him, though, back of their seeming willingness to admit him to their peculiar fellowship, was a reservation. Harlan felt it, saw it in their eyes, and noted it in their manner toward him. They had heard about him. They knew something of his record. Reports of his cleverness with a weapon had come to them, and they were curious. There was speculation in the glances they threw at him. There was some suspicion, cynicism, skepticism, and not a little doubt. It seemed to Harlan that though they had accepted him, they were impatiently awaiting a practical demonstration of those qualities that had made him famous in the country. They wanted to be shown. Their wild, unruly passions and lurid imaginations were the urges that drove them. That shaped their conduct toward their fellows. Some of them were rapid gunslingers, in the picturesque idioms of their speech, and there was not a man among them who did not take pride in his ability to work his gun. They had accepted Harlan, but it was obvious that among them were some that doubted the veracity of rumor, some who felt that Harlan had been overrated. It did not take Harlan long to discover who those doubting spirits were. He saw them watching him. Always with curling lip and truculent eye, he heard references to his ability from them, scraps of conversation in which such terms and phrases as a false alarm, maybe, he don't look it, wears 'em for show, I reckon, were used. He had learned the names of the men. There were 3 of them, known merely as Lanky, Pogs, and Latimer. Their raids upon the cattle in the basin took place at night, and their other depredations occurred at that time also. Harlan did not fail to hear of them, for their successes figured prominently in their daytime conversations, and he had watched the herd of cattle in the Star corrals grow in size until the enclosure grew too small to hold them comfortably. He had noted, too, the cleverness with which the men obliterated the brands on the stolen cattle, or refashioned them until proof of their identity was obscure. He had taken no part in any of the raids, though he had passed a few nights at the Star, directing, with the help of Strom Rogers, the altering of the brands and the other work attending the disguising of the cattle. Hayden he had seen but a few times, and Deveny not at all. He learned from Rogers that Hayden spent most of his time upon mysterious missions which took him to Lamo, to Lizette, and to Las Vegas, and that Deveny operated from a place that Rogers referred to as the Cache, several miles up the valley. Latimer, a tawny giant of a man with a long, hooked nose and thin, cruel lips, interested Harlan. He watched the man when the other was not conscious of his glances, noting the bigness of him, his slow, panther-like movements, the glowing, savage truculence of his eyes, the hard, bitter droop of his lips under the yellow mustache he wore. He felt the threat of the man when the latter looked at him. It was personal and tense, seeming to have motive behind it. It aroused in Harlan a responsive passion. One day, seated on a bench in front of the long bunkhouse near the Star Ranch house, Harlan was watching some of the men who were playing cards near him. They were lounging in the grass, laughingly pitting their skill against one another, while another group in front of the stable was diligently repairing saddles. Apart from the two groups were Lanky, Poggs, and Latimer. They were standing near the corral fence, about 100 feet from where Harlan sat. The subject of their talk was unpleasant, for their faces reflected the venomous passions that inspired it. Latimer had been watching Harlan, his gaze boldly hostile and full of a hate that was unmistakable. And Harlan had not been unaware of Latimer's gaze. He had noted the wolfish gleam in the other's eyes, and because he was interested in Latimer, he watched him covertly. But Harlan had betrayed no sign that he knew Latimer was watching him, and when he saw Strom Rogers coming toward him from the stable, he grinned at him and made room for him when the latter headed for the bench upon which Harlan was sitting. "Lazy day," offered Rogers as he dropped on the bench beside Harlan, not a heap doin. He did not look at Harlan, but leaned forward, took up a cinch buckle that had been lying in the sand at his feet, and turned it idly over and over in his hands, apparently intent on its construction. With his head down, so that even the card players could not see his lips move, he whispered to Harlan, "Don't let 'em see you know I'm talkin'. They're frammin' up on you." Harlan grinned, shielding his lips with a hand that he passed casually over them. "Meanin' Latimer and his friends," he said. "Yep. Latimer's jealous of you. Been jealous. Thinks he can match your gunplay. Itchin' for trouble. Bound to have it out with you. We was at the cache last night, and I heard him and Deveny yappin' about it. Deveny's back of him. He is sore about the way you handed it to him in Lamo. Keep your eyes peeled. They're pullin' it off pretty soon. Latimer's doing the shootin'. He is trying to work himself up to it. Be careful." "I'm thanking you." Harlan leaned back, crossed his legs, and stared off into space, the light in his eyes becoming vacuous. He seemed not to be interested in Latimer and the other two, but in reality he saw them distinctly. But they had their backs to him now and were slowly sauntering toward the stable door. "So Deveny ain't admirin' me none," he said to Rogers, "not scarcely. No more than a gopher is admirin' a sidewinder." "Latimer," said Harlan, "don't like my style of beauty either. I've been noticin' it. He is a mighty interestin' man. If I wasn't dead sure he ain't the kind of a guy which goes around shootin' folks in the back, I'd say he pretty near fits the description I got of the man who helped Dolver salivate my sidekicker, Davy Langan, over in Pardo, a couple of months ago." Rogers' side glance was pregnant with a grim, unsmiling humor. "So you've picked him out. I've been wonderin' how long it would take you." The emotion that passed over Harlan was not visible. It might have been detected, however, by the slight leap in his voice. "You and Latimer is bosom friends, I reckon." "Shucks." Rogers' glance met Harlan's for a fleeting instant. "This gang needs cleaning up," said Rogers. He got up and stood in front of Harlan, holding out the cinch buckle, as though offering it to the other, for both men had seen that Latimer had left his friends at the stable door and was coming slowly toward the bunkhouse. "You'll have to be slick," warned Rogers. "He is comin'. I'll be Mosian out of the way." He moved slowly from the bench, past the group of card players, and walked to the ranch house, where he hung the cinch buckle on a nail driven into the wall of the building. Then he slowly turned, facing the bench upon which Harlan still sat, and toward which Latimer was walking. It was evident that all of the men in the vicinity were aware of the threatened clash, for their manner, upon the approach of Latimer, indicated as much. For weeks they had been eager to test the traditional quickness of Harlan with the weapons that swung at his hips. Those weapons had been a constant irritation to some of them, and an object of speculation to all. And when the night before some of them had heard the whispered word that Latimer, with Deveny's sanction, indeed with Deveny's encouragement, was determined to clash with Harlan, they had realized that the moment for which they had yearned was at hand. For they had seen in Harlan's eyes, and had felt in the atmosphere that surrounded the man, the certainty that he would not refuse the clash with Latimer. The only question in their minds concerning Harlan was that of his speed and accuracy, and so when they saw Latimer coming, they ceased playing cards and sat interestedly watching, alert to note how Latimer would bring about the clash, and how Harlan would meet it. Latimer had nerved himself for the ordeal by talking with his friends. The will to kill Harlan had been in his heart for a long time, but he needed to reinforce it with an artificial rage, and dwelling with his friends upon the irritating fact that Harlan had come among them to usurp authority, to which he had no visible claim. He had succeeded in working his rage to a frenzy that took little account of consequences. Yet Latimer would not have been able to reach that frenzy had he not been convinced that he was Harlan's master with the 6-shooter. He really believed that Harlan had been overrated. He believed that because he wanted to believe it, and because his contempt for the man had bred that conviction in his heart. Also, he thought he knew why Harlan had come to the Star, why he had joined the outlaw camp, and the night before, he had communicated that suspicion to Deveny. It was because Harlan knew he had been with Dolver when Davy Langan had been killed. Latimer thought he had seen a slight relief in Deveny's eyes when he had told the latter that, but he could not be sure, and it was not important. The important thing was that he must kill Harlan, and he meant to do it. He would kill him fairly, if possible, thereby enhancing his reputation, but he was certain to kill him, no matter what the method. That conviction blazed in his eyes as he came to a halt within a dozen paces of where Harlan was sitting. He had worked himself to such a pitch of rage that it gripped him like some strong fever, bloating his face, tensing his muscles, bulging his eyes. Harlan had watched him, and his gaze was on the other now with a steady, unwavering alertness that advertised his knowledge of what was impending. But he sat, motionless, rigid, waiting Latimer's first hostile movement. Harlan had turned a very little when Latimer had begun his walk toward the bench. His right side was slightly toward the man, the leg partially extended, while the left leg was doubled under the bench, seemingly to give him leverage should he decide to rise. But he gave no indication of meditating such a move. It was plain to the watchers that if he attempted it, Latimer would draw his gun and begin to shoot. Latimer was convinced also that Harlan would not attempt to rise. He had Harlan at a disadvantage, and he laughed loudly, sardonically, contemptuously as he stood, his right hand hovering close to his pistol holster, his eyes aflame with hate and passion. "Keep us setting, you buzzard's whelp," he sneered. "Keep us setting. Latimer's out to get you. You know it, eh? You've knowed it right along, pretending not to. Drag Harlan, bah, gunslinger with a record, and caught a setting, caught with the goods on, sneaking in here, trying to catch a man unawares. Bah, don't I know what you're here for? It is me. You blowed Dolver apart for killin' that damned, slick-eyed partner of yourn, Davy Langan. Do you want to know who sent Langan out? I'm tellin' you, it was me. He fairly yelled the last words, and stiffened, holding the fingers of his right hand claw-like above the butt of the holstered pistol. And when he saw that Harlan did not move, that he sat there rigid, his eyes unblinking and expressionless, his right hand hanging limply at his side, near the partially extended leg, his left hand resting upon the thigh of the doubled leg, he stepped closer, watching Harlan's right hand for a space. While one might have counted 10, neither man moved a muscle. Something in Harlan's manner sent into Latimer's frenzied brain the message that all was not what it seemed, that Harlan was meditating some astonishing action. 10 seconds is not long, as time goes, but during that slight interval, the taut nerves of Latimer's were twanged with a torturing doubt that began to creep over him. Would Harlan never make that move? That question was dinned insistently into Latimer's ears. He began to believe that Harlan did not intend to draw, and then, it was Latimer's lungs that breathed the ejaculation, for Harlan's right hand had moved slightly upward toward the pistol at his right hip. It went only a few inches, It was still far below the holster when Latimer's claw-like fingers descended to the butt of his own weapon. The thought that he would beat Harlan in a fair draw was in his mind, that he would beat him despite the confusion of the hesitating motion with which Harlan got his gun out. Something was happening, though, something odd and unexplainable. For though Latimer had seemed to have plenty of time, he was conscious that Harlan's gun was belching fire and death at him. He saw the smoke streaks, felt the bullets striking him, searing their way through him, choking him, weakening his knees. He went down, his eyes wide with incredulity, filling with hideous self-derision when he saw that the pistol which had sent his death to him was not in Harlan's right hand at all, but in his left. Harlan got up slowly as Latimer stretched out in the dust at his feet, casting one swift glance at the fallen man to satisfy himself that for Simpium the incident was ended. Then, with the gaze of every man in the outfit upon him, he strode toward the stable, where Lanky and Pogs were standing, having witnessed the death of their confederate. They stiffened to immobility as they watched Harlan's approach, knowing that for them the incident was not closed, their guilt plain in their faces, and when Harlan halted in front of them they stood, not moving a muscle, their eyes searching Harlan's face for signs that they too were to receive a demonstration of the man's uncanny cleverness. "You was backin' Latimer's play," said Harlan shortly. "I'm aimin' to play the string out. Pull, or I'll blow you apart." Pogs and Lanky did not pull. They stood there, ghastly color stealing into their faces, their eyes wide with the knowledge that death would be the penalty of a hostile movement. Harlan's pistol was again in its holster, and yet they had no desire to provoke the man to draw it. The furtive gleam in the eyes of both revealed the hope that gripped them, that some of the watchers would interfere. But not a man moved. Most of them had been stunned by the rapidity of Harlan's action, by the deftness with which he had brought his left hand into use. They had received the practical demonstration for which they all had longed, and each man's manner plainly revealed his decision to take no part in what was transpiring. They remained in their places while Harlan, understanding that Pogs and Lanky would not accept his invitation, spoke gruffly to them. "This camp ain't got any room for skunks that go to frommin' up on any of the boys. Today you done it to me. Tomorrow you'd try to pull it off on some other guy. You're travelin'. Pronto, you're gettin' your cayuses. Then you're hittin' the breeze away from here, and not comin' back. That lets you out, Mosey." He stood watchful, alert, while the men roped their horses, got their war bags from the bunkhouse, mounted, and rode away without looking back. Then he walked over to the bench where he had been sitting when Rogers had warned him of the plan to kill him, ordered several of the men to take Latimer's body away, and then resumed his place on the bench where he rolled a cigarette. Later, when the men who had gone with Latimer's body returned to the vicinity of the ranch house, Harlan was still sitting on the bench. No man said a word to him, but he saw a new respect in the eyes of all of them, even in Rogers' gaze, which had not strayed from him for an instant during the trouble. And a little later, when Rogers walked to the bench and sat beside him, the other men had resumed their various pastimes as though nothing had happened. Again Rogers whispered to him, lowly, admiringly, "This camp is yours, man, whenever you say the word." Chapter 21. The Black-Bearded Man. It was Strom Rogers who indicated to the outlaws at the Star that henceforth Harlan was to exercise authority of a kind that had formerly been vested in Hayden and Deveny. The corral was packed to suffocation with cattle, threatening the health of the animals. Deveny had sent no word from the cache regarding the disposal of the stock, and Hayden's whereabouts were unknown. Rogers had moved stock on his own initiative in former days, for he had been an able assistant to both leaders, and Rogers could have moved the stock out of the corral and to the point far south where the outlaws had always sold them. But there was malice in Rogers' heart toward the two outlaw leaders, and a perverse devil lurked in him. For many months he had worshipped Barbara Morgan from a distance, vaguely aware that his passion for her could never be realized. But there was a spark of honesty and justice in Rogers despite his profession, and a sincere admiration for the girl that admitted of no thought of evil toward her. He had almost betrayed his resentment to Deveny when in Lamo, on the day of the coming of Harlan. Deveny had boldly announced his intentions toward the girl, and it had been a dread of clashing with Deveny that had kept him from interfering. The will to protect the girl had been in Rogers' mind, but he lacked the physical courage to risk his life for her. This man who had boldly entered the outlaw camp After first defying Deveny and Lamo, had made a stirring appeal to the good in Rogers, and he foresaw that trouble, in which Harlan had a chance to emerge victorious, was certain, and he had decided to align himself with the Pardo gunman. Therefore, on this morning, when it was certain that the cattle in the corral must be moved, he deliberately refused to exercise his prerogative. Instead, he waited until after breakfast, when the men were congregated outside the bunkhouse door. When he was certain they would all hear him. Harlan had come out too. He had not visited the Rancho Seco for more than a week, fearing that his absence might jeopardize the advantage he had gained over the men through the killing of Latimer. With the attention of all the men centered upon him, Rogers walked close to Harlan, speaking loudly. "Them cattle ought to hit the trail, Harlan. It is up to you. You're the boss. Do we move 'em? And where?" A comprehensive light gleamed in Harlan's eyes. "They move," he said shortly. "Drive them where you've been driven them." As though he had been giving orders to the outlaws all his life, he briskly mentioned the names of the men who were to form the trail herd. Not a man dissented. Those whose names were called quickly detached themselves from the group and sought the horse corral, where they roped their horses and began to make preparations to obey Harlan's order. And later, when the cattle were driven out of the corral and the trail herd crew straggled behind them over the level that led southward, the men were grinning, for Harlan had told them that their share of the spoils resulting from the sale of the cattle was to be materially increased. He had likewise told them that they might spend an extra day in town before their return. Only one man besides Harlan remained at the Star after the herd vanished into the southern distance. That man was the black, bearded fellow who had escorted Harlan to the ranch house on the occasion of his first visit, Leif Woodward. This man's admiration for Harlan had never been concealed. He had stayed as close to Harlan as possible, and from his manner Harlan had divined that the man was eager to ingratiate himself. Woodward stood near Harlan as the herd and the men vanished. He had grinned widely when, just before the outfit had departed, he had heard Rogers whisper to Harlan, "You've made yourself solid with the bunch, for sure, by offering 'em a bigger divvy. They've been grumbling about it for a long time. They're all sore at Hayden and Deveny for being greedy. But you're sure cooking up a heap of trouble with Hayden and Deveny." Harlan grinned with grim mirthlessness. It had been his first opportunity to stir up dissension and strife in the outlaw camp, and he had taken instant advantage of it. He had created factional feeling, and he was prepared to accept the consequences. And later in the day, when he saw Hayden ride in, dismount, and cast a surprised glance at the empty corral, he knew that the moment for which he had planned had come. Woodward was nowhere in sight, and Harlan, who had been in the blacksmith shop, made himself visible to Hayden by stepping outside. Hayden called to him sharply, and Harlan walked slowly to where the outlaw chief stood, a saturnine grin on his face, his eyes alight with a cold humor that might have been illuminating to Hayden had he taken the trouble to look into them. Hayden was laboring under some strong passion. He was suppressing it with an effort, but it showed in his tensed muscles and in his flushed face. "Where are the cattle?" he demanded, his voice a trifle hoarse. "They're headed for Willow Wells, where you've been selling them." "By whose orders?" Hayden's voice was choked with passion. "Mine," drawled Harlan. Harlan might have explained that the stock had been suffering in the crowded enclosure, thus assuaging Hayden's wrath, but he gave no explanation. That would have been a revelation of eagerness to escape blame and the possible consequences of his act. Instead of explaining, he looked steadily into Hayden's eyes, his own cold and unblinking. He saw Hayden's wrath flare up. It was in the heightened color that spread upward above the collar of his shirt. He saw the man's terrific effort at self-control, and his look grew bitter with insolence. "What is bothering you?" he said. "The cattle." "Damn it," shouted Hayden. "What in hell do you mean by sending them away without orders?" "I'm having my say, Hayden. We agreed to split everything 3 ways. Authority to give orders goes with that. That was the agreement. A man's got to be either a captain or a private, and I've never played second to any man. I ain't beginning now. Why, damn you," gasped Hayden. His eyes were aglare with a terrible rage and hate. He stepped backward a little, bending his right arm, spreading the fingers. Harlan had made no move, but the light in his eyes betrayed his complete readiness for the trouble that Hayden plainly meditated. "Yes," he said, slowly, drawling his words a little. "It has come to that, I reckon. You've got to flash your gun now, or take it back. No man cusses me and gets away with it. Get going." Hayden stood, swaying from side to side in the grip of a mighty indecision. The fingers of his right hand spread wider. The hand descended to a point nearer to his pistol holster. There it poised, the fingers hooked, like the talons of some giant bird about to clutch a victim. Had Hayden faced a man with less courage? Had Harlan's iron control lacked that quality which permitted him to give an enemy that small chance for life which he always gave them? Death might have reigned at the Star again. Hayden owed his life to that hesitation, which had made Harlan famous. And as the strained, tense seconds passed with both men holding the positions they had assumed, it seemed Hayden was slowly beginning to realize that Harlan was reluctant, was deliberately giving him a chance. A change came over Hayden. The claw-like fingers began to straighten, imperceptibly at first, and then with a spasmodic motion that flexed the muscles in little jerks. The hand became limp. It dropped slowly to his side, down beyond the pistol holster. Then it came up, and the man swept it over his eyes, as though to brush away a vision that frightened him. His face grew pale, he shuddered, and at last he stood, swaying a little, his mouth open with wonder for the phenomenal thing that had happened to him. Harlan's voice, cold and expressionless, startled him. "You wasn't monin' to cuss me." "No." The denial was blurted forth. Hayden grinned faintly with hideous embarrassment. The knowledge that he had been beaten and that he owed his life to Harlan was plain in his eyes. He laughed uncertainly as he made an effort to stiffen his lagging muscles. "I was a bit flustered, Harlan. I talked rather recklessly, I admit. You see, I've been used to giving orders myself. I was riled for a minute." "That goes," said Harlan shortly. His voice had changed, the slow drawl had gone, and a snapping, authoritative sharpness had replaced it. Hayden gazed at him with a new wonder. He sensed in Harlan's manner the consciousness of power, the determination to command. At a stroke, it seemed, Harlan had wrenched from him the right to rule. He felt himself being relegated to a subordinate position. He felt at this minute the ruthless force of the man who stood before him. He felt oddly impotent and helpless, and he listened to Harlan with a queer feeling of wonder for the absence of the rage that should have gripped him. "I'm running things from now on," Harlan said. "I ain't interfering with the Star, but I'm running things for the boys. I told Rogers to drive the cattle to Willow's Wells. And to sell them, I've promised the boys a bigger divvy. They get it. I've told them to take a day off in town after they turn the cattle over. There has got to be a new deal. The boys are fussed up, claiming they ain't getting their share. I'm seeing that they do. You can't run a camp like this and not treat the boys right." The wonder that had been aroused in Hayden grew as Harlan talked. It increased in intensity until, when Harlan's voice died away, it developed into suspicion. That was what Harlan had come to the Star for. He wanted to run the camp to direct the activities of the outlaws in the valley. Power, authority, those were the things Harlan craved for. Hayden saw it all, now. He saw that Harlan wanted to dominate everything. He wanted to rule the outlaw camp. He wanted to run the Rancho Seco. He intended to get possession of the gold that Morgan had left, and he wanted Barbara Morgan. The rage that had held Hayden in its clutch when he had called Harlan to him was reviving. Hayden's face was still white, but the fury in his eyes, slowly growing, was not to be mistaken. Harlan saw it, and his lips straightened. He had expected Hayden would rage over what he had determined to tell him, and he was not surprised. He had deliberately goaded the man into his present fury. He had determined to kill him, and he had been disappointed when he had seen Hayden lose his courage when the crisis arrived. And now his deliberate and premeditated plan was to bear fruit. Harlan was reluctant to kill, but there seemed to be no other way. Hayden was a murderer. He had killed Lane Morgan. He was an outlaw whose rule had oppressed the valley for many months. If Harlan could have devised some plan that would make it possible for him to attain his end without killing anybody, he would have eagerly adopted it. But in this country, force must be fought with force. It was a grim game, and the rules were inflexible. Kill or be killed. His own life would be safe in this section so long as he guarded it. Eternal vigilance and the will to take life when his own was threatened was a principle which custom had established. If he expected to save the girl at the Rancho Seco, he could not temper his actions with mercy. And he knew that if he was to succeed in his design to disrupt the outlaw gang, he would have to remove the man who stood before him, working himself into a new frenzy. There seemed to be no other way, but Hayden seemed to have control of himself. Now, despite the frenzied glare of his eyes, he was outwardly cool. His movements were deliberate. He had conquered his fear of Harlan, it seemed. He laughed harshly. "Harlan," he said, "you had me going. Talking that way. By heaven, you almost convinced me that I'd tunlita. You run things here. I was beginning to believe I'd lost my nerve. But see here." He held out his right hand toward Harlan. It was steady, rigid, not a nerve in it quivered. "You're fast with your guns, but you can't run any whizzer in on me. You can't intimidate me. You killed Latimer the other day, and you've got the boys with you. But you can't run things here. Have all the boys gone? Woodward's here." Harlan spoke lowly. His eyes were keenly watchful. This flare-up on Hayden's part was merely a phase of his confused mental condition. He saw that Hayden did not mean to use his gun, that he intended to ignore it, no doubt planning to regain his authority when the men of the outfit returned, when he might enlist the support of some of them. "Woodward's here." "Hey," laughed Hayden. He raised his voice, shouting for the man, and Harlan saw Woodward come from behind an outbuilding, look toward the ranch house, and then walk slowly toward them. Woodward halted when within several paces of the two, and looked from one to the other curiously. His eyes narrowed with speculation. "Woodward," directed Hayden, "hit the breeze after the outfit and tell them to drive those cattle back here." Harlan grinned. He said gently, "You climb on your cayuse and do as Hayden tells you. Hayden is figurin' on Cashin, and when you do." Hayden blustered. "What do you mean?" "I mean that if Woodward goes after the boys, I'm going to blow you apart. I'm giving the orders around here." Watching Hayden, Harlan saw that he was not exhibiting rage but intense interest. He was not looking at Harlan but at Woodward, and turning swiftly, his guns both leaping into his hands with the movement, for he had a swift suspicion that Woodward might be standing with Hayden against him. He saw that Woodward had fallen into a crouch, that the man's right hand was hovering over his pistol holster, and that his eyes were gleaming with a light that could mean only the one thing: murder, backing slowly away from both Hayden and Woodward. Harlan watched them, his guns ready for instant action should he catch any sign that would indicate trickery toward himself. He saw no such signs. It became plain to him that Woodward had no eyes for anyone but Hayden, and that Hayden's attention was fixed upon Woodward with an intentness that meant he had divined that Woodward's peculiar manner had a definite personal meaning. Woodward continued to advance on Hayden. He was waving his left hand as though giving Harlan a silent order to get out of his way, while his gaze was centered upon Hayden with an unspoken promise of violence, fascinating to behold. It seemed to have fascinated Hayden. Harlan saw him shrink back, the bluster gone out of him, his face the color of ashes. He kept stepping back until he brought up against the rear wall of the ranch house, and there he stood, watching Woodward, his eyes bulging with dread wonder. Harlan saw his lips move, heard his voice, hoarse and throaty. "It is a frame-up. A frame-up. Both of you are out to get me. Frame up." This was Woodward. He was a sinister figure, with his black beard seeming to bristle with passion, his eyes flaming with it, all his muscles tensed and quivering, and his right hand with claw-like fingers poised above the butt of his pistol. "Frame up," he repeated, laughing hoarsely between his teeth. "Hell's fire. Do you think it takes two men to get you? You miserable whelp. I've been waiting for this day. Waiting for it. Waiting to get you alone. Waiting for the boys to go so's I could tell you something. You know what it is. You ain't guessing, eh? Listen while I tell you something." The day Drag Harlan got in Lamo, he brought news that Lane Morgan had been killed out in the desert. "I heard the boys sign you had a hand in it, but I thought that was just talk. I didn't believe you was that kind of a skunk. I waited. Then you sent me over to the edge of the level near the Rancho Seco, where Harlan found that flattened grass when he rode over here. You told me to watch Harlan and Barbara Morgan. You said you thought Harlan would try some sneak game with her. You can gamble I watched. I saw Harlan standing guard over her. I saw him follow that sneak Lawson. I heard the shot that killed Lawson, and I saw Harlan tote him downstairs, and then set on the door, still all night guarding Barbara Morgan. The sneaking game was played by you, Hayden. When I saw Harlan heading toward the valley the day he come here, I lit out ahead of him. And when he got to the timber over there, I brought him in. And I heard you talk that day. I heard him saying that you killed Lane Morgan. He said my dad told him you fired the shot that killed him." Harlan started and leaned forward, amazed. But Hayden swayed, and then steadied himself with an effort, and stared at Woodward's bulging, incredulous eyes. "Your dad?" he almost shrieked. Lane Morgan was your father." Woodward's grin was wolfish. He took 2 or 3 steps toward Hayden, panther-like steps that betrayed the lust that was upon him. "I'm Billy Morgan," he said, his teeth showing in a merciless grin. "Barbara's brother. Flash your gun, Hayden. I'm going to kill you." Hayden clawed for his pistol, missing the butt in his eagerness and striving wildly to draw it. It snagged on a rawhide thong that supported the holster, and his fingers were loosening in the partial grip when Billy Morgan shot him. He flattened against the wall of the ranch house for an instant, staring wildly around him. Then his head sagged forward and he slid down the wall of the ranch house into the deep dust that was mounded near it.